From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta. Michigan's open U.S. Senate race is a national attention grabber.
And on the Democratic side, it's getting more and more competitive. Late last week, the UAW endorsed Abdul El-Sayed in the primary. To help us understand where the race stands, we're joined by Lauren Gibbons of Bridge, Michigan, and Zach Stanton of MS Now. Hey, you two.
Hey, how's it going?
Thanks for having me.
So, Lauren, can you just first put the race into context as of this week on the Democratic side?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been competitive. It's continuing to be competitive. But of course, as you mentioned, the UAW was something that all of these candidates really wanted. It's not a monolith by any means, Michigan's labor movement, but in terms of the Democratic endorsement cycle, these are some of the cream of the crop endorsements that all of the candidates really desire. They've all been pushing to get support from various factions of the labor movement. And so the UAW weighing in here was significant. It was a big deal, I think, for Abdul El-Sayed's campaign. That said, it's not necessarily a guarantee that labor is going to line up behind Abdul El-Sayed. There are a lot of different opinions, just like in the Democratic primary overall. A lot of the folks that I've spoken to in the labor movement have said, it's people are coming from different places and trying to make decisions just like every other Democrat in the state.
We will circle back to that endorsement. But first, Zach, I want to ask you, how are you thinking about the race right now?
Well, I think from the national perspective, this is a race that Democrats are really sweating. There's been some talk in recent weeks about sort of a vibe shift nationally where Democrats finally feel like the U.S. Senate might be in play, not just the U.S. House. And critical to any chance of them retaking the Senate is holding on to Michigan. And Michigan is a state that Trump has won in, 2 of the past 3 presidential elections. It's a state where Mike Rogers just narrowly lost in 2024. And it's a state that Republicans are really spending a lot of money on as Democrats sort of tear their hair out here in the competitive primary. A lot of national money from Democrats right now is going into largely a Haley Stevens campaign, but very little is being spent by national Democrats on defining Mike Rogers, which is a concern that I know Democratic strategists I've talked with have voiced to me. They feel like this is a guy who almost won last time, who is fortunate in the sense that he has an identity that predates Trump in the Republican Party, and so he's not anathema to a lot of moderate Republicans who might otherwise be turned off by Trump. And so given that, and given the real divide in the Democratic Party, where you see Abdul and Haley and Mallory, I should say Abdul El-Sayed, Haley Stevens, and Mallory McMorrow, sort of all competitive, all in the double digits, none seemingly on the verge of dropping out or anything of the sort. You see a real divide in the party, and it's read in many ways as like a precursor to what the party's divides could be in 2028 in the presidential campaign.
I mean, Zach, do you see this as sort of a self-inflicted wound, how hard they're going after each other and how this primary is turning out before August?
I mean, there are 2 ways to think about it. One is that competition can make you a stronger candidate. And this was sort of the 2008 argument of the Obama versus Hillary campaign, that, that campaign dragging on as long as it did, in some ways made Obama a sharper candidate in the general election, even as they wish they could have put that campaign away earlier in the cycle. But the other way of seeing it is that, Democrats are defining themselves, bloodying one another up in a way that they're just sort of softening themselves for the general election. I am surprised that there has not been as much movement in the campaign, that it does seem largely like it is right now sort of rehashing some of the divides that we saw in 2020 among Democrats, where you have sort of a real establishment Democrat lane, you have a sort of insurgent Bernie-style campaign, and then you have a very competent, almost technocratic lane of an Elizabeth Warren type. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be more or less the way things are playing out so far, which has been a bit of a surprise. And I'm looking here in the next 8-9 weeks until the campaign ends. I feel like it's only going to get a little more sharp-elbowed, and that's going to be a real sight to behold.
So, Lauren, let's circle back to the big news late last week that the United Auto Workers Union was endorsing Abdul El Sayed. Why did the UAW say they were endorsing him?
They cited his long-standing track record of not accepting funding from corporate political action committees as one big reason. And I think that's pretty interesting because you have heard, especially from UAW leadership, interest in someone who's able to fight some of those influences and stand up for workers' rights. So that was ultimately the reason that they gave. And that is pretty interesting because in this race, we have seen corporate PAC money become this major issue in a lot of these debates and forums that the campaigns have had, and a big point of attack in the primary, especially against Haley Stevens, who has continued to accept corporate PAC donations. Mallory McMorrow has accepted corporate political donations in the past, does not anymore. Abdul Sayed has obviously made that a point of contention and said that he never has, never will, and is making that a pretty big case for voters. So I thought that was interesting. Like I said earlier, I don't necessarily see this as necessarily speaking for every single union voter, every single worker in Michigan. Definitely interesting. I wouldn't come out and say, this means that Abdul Sayed is the front runner. There's still so much debate left to have, so many undecided Democratic voters here in Michigan still.
I mean, Zach, that's the point. There isn't a monolithic union voter anymore in Michigan, is there?
Right. Not at all. And the UAW has always had a reputation as being one of the more politically progressive unions across the spectrum of unions. And that has led them sometimes to make much more ideologically minded arguments rather than perhaps politically pragmatic ones at times. And we see that in their endorsement record, in the past where they've endorsed candidates like David Bonnier for governor in 2002, or they have a string of endorsements in the Detroit mayoral campaigns over the last 20 some years, ranging from Solomon Kinloch last year to Gil Hill in 2001. And they've come up short in a number of those races. But this is a sign, certainly a positive sign for Abdul, in the sense of it feeds this image of him as having a lot of momentum behind his campaign. And it feeds this image of him as solidifying support among progressives. And, that is certainly something that Abdul is going to just continue to lean into.
Lauren, I mean, is he solidifying support, and does he have momentum now?
I think we have seen there has been momentum behind his campaign, even back to the endorsement convention for the Democratic Party. He was cheered loudly by progressives. He had a big showing there. Some of those same people then booed Haley Stevens when she took the stage. I think overall, you are seeing progressives really coalesce around Abdul Sayed, and part of that is because he has the support of Bernie Sanders. He's brought Bernie Sanders to Michigan. He continues to have an outsized importance to that specific subset of voter. I think where still remains to be seen, Haley Stevens also has a pretty solid group of more moderate Democrats, more of the establishment. You saw Debbie Stabenow come out in support for Jennifer Granholm, Michigan's former governor. And then Mallory McMorrow is still sort of defining her lane, but she's pulling from some of those, as I think you mentioned, Zach, those Elizabeth Warren types of progressive voters who might find her case of this track record of legislative success appealing. So I don't think that this race is decided by any means. There's still a lot that needs to be hashed out.
Zach, I'd like to talk for a moment about sort of the two tracks in any election campaign, primary or general. And one is to persuade voters to support you, and the other is to persuade supporters or near supporters to make the effort to cast a ballot in polling that's measured as voter intensity. How do you see that playing into this primary?
Well, I think as Lauren just suggested, Abdul has very intense support. The people that support him are really into his campaign. And, that's not something that you're going to turn away because ultimately that sort of support can more easily transform into volunteer hours and people knocking on doors or making calls, doing phone banks. And all of that really matters. And, that's another reason, frankly, that the UAW endorsement could be helpful if they do actually lean into it and go into turning out the vote and persuading voters. And that's sort of indicative of the way that the campaigns are approaching their general election strategy too, in that Abdul al-Sayed is making this argument both that he can turn out progressives, but also that he can potentially win over people who supported Donald Trump, who maybe are open to someone who's just a total change agent. Similar to the way that you saw some crossover voters who were Trump voters, but also voted for Zoran Mamdani in New York. And he sees that as a real possibility for him. There are other Democrats who fret that Abdul al-Sayed would be in their eyes, a really challenging general election candidate and someone who isn't going to get the sort of crossover vote or the sort of moderate voter that the Democrats might otherwise want to grab the attention of. So we'll see how that all shakes out. But, voter intensity is certainly something that you want in your sales, especially in a primary, which is, not an ideal time for a lot of people. It's generally the most intense voters that turn out to vote
Right.
In primaries.
We are speaking with Zach Stanton of MS Now and Lauren Gibbons of Bridge, Michigan. Lauren, PAC money, Medicare for all, support for Israel, all issues that have come up on this campaign. You have been covering it since the beginning. What are you noticing voters are watching the closest right now?
I keep hearing from everyone I talk to about this, every issue ultimately stems back to the affordability question. Even the other week, I was working on a piece about energy policy. And even in that very niche sphere, it's affordability that people are talking about in terms of all these prices going up. Gas prices has been a huge issue. The economic factor has been a key focus. And I think we have heard the campaigns come back to that as well. When it comes to healthcare, a lot of the issues are coming back to higher premiums, whether the quality of care is really being negated by the cost. And so that's a big theme that we've seen throughout, regardless of the policy issues. And then the other thing, like I mentioned, is coming back to foreign policy, at least in this primary cycle. It remains to be seen whether that will continue to come up in the general election. When it comes to these Democratic voters, the questions about AIPAC funding, for example, have just continued to plague Haley Stevens and to some extent McMorrow, even though she hasn't accepted funding from them. There have been some questions from voters like, well, do you have any connections here? Have you spoken to them even? And so I think that's something that is going to continue to be a question for Democrats, especially going into the general.
Another example, Zach, of just how nationalized this campaign is.
Oh, absolutely. And indeed, just a couple hours ago, as we are talking, the United Democracy Project, which is the super political action committee, the super PAC, aligned with AIPAC, debuted their first ad in the Senate race for Haley Stevens. And it draws on older, from an earlier campaign, footage of Barack Obama praising Haley Stevens for her work on the Auto Rescue Task Force. But if you didn't know that and didn't have the context for it, you would very easily think that it's Barack Obama endorsing Haley Stevens. But the AIPAC has pushed in, I think, $2.3 million was the most recent number I saw. It's a good time to own a TV network in Michigan, I guess. But it's going to be a huge, huge money battle. And I think if I'm Mallory McMorrow right now, what I am trying to keep in mind is like I've won a lot of the money race so far. I've raised a lot of money, and at some point you need to really spend that money you can't take it with you in a very real sense. And they need to go up very soon with their spending, because otherwise they'll very quickly, be overrun by Haley Stevens' independent expenditures.
So, Zach, as we wrap up, one name that we have barely, just a little mentioned, is former Congressman Mike Rogers. He's the presumptive, near certain Republican nominee, already secured some $45 million in just the outside spending in this race. What's he up to while this Democratic infighting continues?
Well, I think he's up to two things, really. One is that he is defining himself, and he is trying to shore up support from the Trump voters. He is already looking ahead to the general because why not if you're him? And so some of that is also trying to define the Democrats and trying to define folks like Abdul El-Sayed, pinning them to past positions that they may no longer have on things like funding police. And Mike Rogers is, I think, eager to get into this campaign. And there's some amount of it that leaning into a fight with Abdul El-Sayed is useful for him in the sense of if he can elevate Abdul El-Sayed or make it, attack him as too progressive for Michigan or something like that, that can really be a signal to progressive voters and to Democratic primary voters that, oh, this is the guy, like this is the progressive that we want. It's in the same way that we've seen both parties do this nationally, where Democrats will go in and say that so-and-so is too aligned with Donald Trump, which is a very appealing thing if you're a Republican primary voter, or too liberal for such and such state, which if you're a Democrat might also be something that appeals to you. So there is a bit of that going on as well. But I think for right now, Mike Rogers is just content to watch the Democrats go at one another.
We should note before we wrap up, Lauren, that the Democrats going after each other at a forum just a few days ago said that they all agreed to back each other after the primary, no matter who wins.
Yes, that's correct. So it does. They are optimistic that they can coalesce and come around. But to the point about Mike Rogers, I think a lot of Republicans really see this as an opportunity that is similar to what Democrats had in 2024. Alyssa Slotkin was able to really bank away a lot of funding, prepare for the general in a way that Mike Rogers was not able to at that time because he had a very competitive primary, but he was always considered the front runner, I think, but had challenges for sure. And so in 2026, it's a different thing. And even though Democrats nationally are really optimistic about their potential to, make some big gains in Congress, Mike Rogers has a lot of backing in a clear lane where all of these Democrats, after having a particularly spicy primary, will have to come together and go up against a very powerful candidate.
That is Lauren Gibbons of Bridge, Michigan, joined by Zach Stanton of MS Now. Hey, you two, thanks so much for the time and sorting this all out.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks. You.
And that is It's Just Politics for today. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Let's talk again next week.